Okay, hi everyone. Welcome back. That's the first One War seminar series talk after the Easter break. It's my pleasure having here today Emtiyaz, who is a team leader at the Riken Center for Advanced Intelligence Project in Japan, in Tokyo, and is the leader of the Approximate Bayesian Inference team, and also an external professor at the Okinawa Institute. That's a wonderful place in Japan. Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology. Thank you again for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I'm always very happy to talk to Bayesians. So I'll talk about the Bayesian learning rule, something that has taken me personally many years in the last decade, been working on this. The slides for this talk, you can find it online on my website. And you can also see there's some summary of our research from last year, some recent things that we have been doing. And yeah, with that, maybe I'll start the talk. So we'll start with the big picture overview of what my research interests are. For many years, like many other machine learning people, I'm interested in designing AI systems that can learn like us, like humans and animals. And the particular ability that I've been focusing on is the ability to quickly adapt to learn new skills and then keep doing this throughout their lives. And if you've seen my talk before, this is kind of the motivation for me. This is my daughter when she was 6 months old. She's trying to kind of figure out her place in the universe by gathering observation, by touching everything that's around her, exploring the world. And slowly she's figuring out that the interesting part of this world is this ukulele where the sound is coming from, and she's attracted to that, and she's trying to collect more observations from that place that she likes. She's figuring out what she likes and dislike. And this is the kind of amazing thing about human learning that, so this is after 6 months, that we slowly kind of our posterior somehow concentrates and we figure out what kind of things we prefer in the world, what kind of things we like. And then we kind of live our life by maybe, going and generating that data more and more, that experience, reliving it, and maybe not stopping there, but moving on and using our past skills to acquire new skills. So this is 2 months after ukulele is replaced by a guitar. It's a bigger instrument, but she likes the sound, and that's the experience now in this new environment. She's able to get by quickly adapting her skills to get that same experience. So this is this amazing thing about human learning that we don't have right now in our machine learning algorithms. So we've been kind of working on trying to understand properties of algorithms, and we believe that natural algorithms like the one that runs in our heads versus the artificial algorithms that we design and run on our computers, they should have some kind of similarity. So we've been thinking about common origins of algorithm, and the question is kind of similar to origin of species. So here we're not saying the common principles behind living organisms, but rather we're saying what are common principles behind artificial popular algorithms. So things that work well, we expect them to have some common principles behind them. There is a reason why they are, why those algorithms are doing well. So we're trying to figure out this common principle. And that's been the work for several years. Well, it's been quite nice. I mean, being in this Bayesian meeting, turns out that some of the principles of good algorithm, what we find, they're related to information geometry of Bayes. So the Bayes kind of shows up there, and by using this information geometry, we're able to show that many good algorithms that we use in machine learning, they're all kind of have a common origin from Bayes, and they're all exploiting information geometry of this Bayesian posterior. So this helps us to unify these algorithms and then generalize this idea to other algorithms that exist in different communities, and then use these ideas to design and improve new learning algorithm. So the central kind of point in this talk that I'll present, it's about optimizing for approximation of the posterior. So you could do exact posterior computation, and that has the same kind of property. But if you do posterior approximation, that also has very similar, property that lots of good algorithms, they can be seen as optimizing for these posterior approximations. So I'll present a learning rule that I call Bayesian learning rule. So this is an optimization algorithm that's optimizing for the Bayesian objective. But then by optimizing the Bayesian objective, we are able to then derive, as special cases, many other algorithms that are non-Bayesian. So the algorithms that occur in optimization, in deep learning, and also many kinds of Bayesian inference methods. They're all kind of instances of this Bayesian learning rule. So that's what I'm going to show you today. And maybe one thing that you want to take out of this is that information geometry really is central to this like goodness of the algorithm. So the property of these algorithms that makes them good to extract new information, for example, from data, is because of information geometry. And I'll show that something called natural gradients really kind of do the right thing whenever you put them in the right context. Okay, so
it's still not great, is it?
I'm sorry?
Sorry.
Is that a question?
No, my connection's very bad. I wasn't sorry. I didn't realise I was unmuted. I apologise.
Okay, no problem. Well, I was very surprised to get a question this early on, but I'm glad that I haven't already lost you. So, okay. So, yeah, so let me just start this. So the Bayesian learning rule, essentially the main point is that the new information, when you do our Bayesian updating, whether it be by exact Bayes rule or by doing some kind of optimization algorithm that's trying to approximate the Bayes rule, all of those optimization, the new information sort of comes through natural gradient. So we can see the new information, we can always write it as a natural gradient. And essentially, this leads to this kind of result. So this is the main result of the paper. You could see it in the table 1 in the paper. Essentially, what we do is we change the form of the posterior approximation. And then within that, we have to make some further approximation to the natural gradient that's being used in the Bayesian learning rule. By making these two choices, we can obtain all sorts of algorithms. So like gradient descent, Newton method, other things you can derive, and SGD, RMSprop, dropout, these methods are used in deep learning. Then stuff like Laplace's method, EM, stochastic variational inference, message passing algorithm, and all sorts of new things that have come around them that can run on non-conjugate models. All of this can be obtained from the same rule by changing the posterior approximation and then making some further approximations to the natural gradient. Okay, so then this gives you a single way to kind of unify things where you approximate a bunch of things to get different flavors of algorithms. Now I'll try to show why this is also useful in the end in the context of deep learning. Okay, so let me first explain show the form of the Bayesian learning rule. So usually I give this talk to non-Bayesian audience, so I always start with the non-Bayesian slide, but maybe I should have changed it for today's talk. But I'll just follow these slides that I have. So the one that people use in machine learning right now, the principle, it's kind of trial and error. So it's a frequentist idea. You do some kind of risk, and then you try to minimize the risk. So maximum likelihood principle is also something like that. You have a loss function. You write that on the current data that you have in hand, and then you have a model with some parameters theta, and then you minimize. And you minimize and you get one single parameter. So it's a point estimate. It's not a posterior distribution. right? So just to give an example, like mean square error on a deep neural network with some input image xi, output label yi, with some regularizer. It's a very familiar thing for us in machine learning. And the popular thing now in machine learning is to use gradient-based methods where you compute the gradient, you do some kind of preconditioning, you update your parameter. You get one single parameter. And this works quite well. But what we are going to argue that actually maybe we shouldn't be thinking about one parameter. We should be thinking about distribution over parameters. And once you put a distribution over the parameter, then you have an information geometry already that comes with it. So then we can show that if we interpret these algorithms as optimizing a distribution, then we can exploit the information geometry and we can unify them. We can show that all of them are just optimizing different distribution, but they're all optimizing the same objective, which is a Bayesian objective. So the Bayesian objective, I think, more familiar to the people in this audience. Often the way it's actually written is that you specify a generative model, right? So you specify a Bayesian model where you have a log likelihood, you have a prior, and you can write Bayes' rule in this form. So this is just kind of an alternate way to write it. I don't know if you are familiar with this paper by Zellner. It's a beautiful paper where they write information processing as Bayes' theorem by writing an optimization program, right? So here the optimization would be over all possible probability distribution. But when you minimize this with respect to Q, so Q is a posterior candidate. If it's over all possible distribution, then you will recover the Bayesian posterior. So that you can actually very easily just take the derivative of this, set it to 0, and you will see that Q would be the exact posterior distribution. It's there in the paper, my paper that I have been talking about, Khan and Rue. You can see it in the appendix. But this is where I lose most Bayesian, by the way, because maybe this is not very familiar to everybody because it's written in an optimization way, but you can trust me that it's exactly same as Bayes' rule. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to sort of go into a little bit more generalized framework where we may not have a Bayesian model. Maybe we have a loss function, and maybe there is a regularizer, so there's a prior. But it's a little bit more generalized version where I write the objective function to the log likelihood and the prior. They're sort of put together into a loss. And then the entropy term, which is usually there in the KL, which is the relative entropy, I've just put it here separately. So it's just a slight rewrite of that, but it's the same optimization function. But instead of a log likelihood, I'm using a log likelihood and a prior. I'm using a generic loss function. Okay, so you can call it generalized Bayes. And then when we minimize it, instead of minimizing over all possible distribution, we're going to restrict it to some kind of exponential family. Okay, so I'm going to call this generalized approximate Bayesian problem. And it's kind of a variant of the exact Bayes. So I hope that you're with me, but I can stop here if you have any questions about this objective. Okay, so if we are cool with this, then this is what it's going to be. So we're going to use this objective, but we're going to choose the posterior approximation. So just to remind you, I'll just go a little bit more into what these distribution Q are going to be. So we will use minimal exponential family. It's a specific class where you could write the Q theta in terms of natural parameter and some sufficient statistics, very standard stuff. So like Gaussian is, for example, is a minimal exponential family where you have this kind of quadratic thing, but then you can rewrite it in a linear form with the sufficient statistics theta and theta theta transpose, and then the parameter. So this is mean and the precision. They form the natural parameter. So there's two sets of natural parameters, and you can write it in that form. Right? So I hope that you remember back. You probably already know these things. But then we're going to use this natural parameter, but an alternate parameterization, expectation parameter, which is essentially just the expectation of the sufficient statistics. So you have theta and theta transpose. So this is going to be mean and the correlation. So it's not the mean and the covariance, it's the mean and the correlation. So we're going to make use of lambda and mu. Okay, and then we're going to optimize this Bayesian objective with respect to one of these parameters. We'll see both of them will appear. But what's important to remember is that lambda is a natural parameter, mu is the expectation parameter. Because they're minimal family, there's a bijection between the two. So there's one-to-one mapping. But if any of this is difficult, just remember that it's just a function of mean and the covariance, or the mean and the position. Right? So, okay, so now we are ready to introduce the rule. So what we are going to, okay, sorry, I have actually written all these things, but I didn't explain this, but lambda and mu are these two things. Okay, so now we are ready to present to you the Bayesian learning rule. So what we are actually saying is that instead of doing this frequentist thing that people do in machine learning often, minimize a loss with respect to theta, let's solve a Bayesian problem where now this same loss is used here. It need not be a Bayesian model, but you can still kind of apply the Bayesian principle to it, and you can minimize an objective. And we're going to find a posterior approximation. So we are making a point that good algorithms don't do something like what's on the left. Good algorithms do something that is on the right. So something like a Bayesian objective. Okay. Now to derive those good algorithms from this, we're going to write an optimization algorithm that we call Bayesian learning rule. It will basically optimize this objective, and it does it in a very specific way. So it exploits the information geometry. It's a natural gradient descent algorithm. And if you don't know information geometry or natural gradients, just don't worry about it. Just think of it as an optimization algorithm. So you're going to update the natural parameter of this queue. So you're going to update the get new candidates by updating the natural parameters. And you're going to update that by taking the gradient of this objective. Everything is kind of so far is fine. But we're not going to take gradient with respect to lambda, which is what is done in usual gradient descent. But instead, we're going to take the gradient with respect to the expectation parameter. Okay, so it turns out that this gradient is actually a natural gradient in terms of lambda. So this is kind of natural gradient descent. It's a little bit convoluted to think about it, but because there's a mapping between lambda and mu, if you start to write this gradient in terms of lambda, you'll get a Fisher information matrix in front, and you get a preconditioning with the Fisher, which makes it a natural gradient descent algorithm. So those who know natural gradient descent algorithm, they can kind of think about how the Fisher shows up. But if you don't know it, then just think of it as an optimization algorithm that's using this lambda mu pair to somehow do the clever trick. Okay, so the one nice thing is that you can, so for exponential families where base measure is 1, which is mostly the case, you can actually show that the gradient of this entropy is just the natural parameter. It's a very beautiful property that the lambda and mu, they make sort of two dual space, and lambda sits in here, mu sits in here. And if you take the gradient with respect to mu of the entropy, you kind of land in the natural parameter space. So actually, yeah, this is like a general property of all conjugate models, by the way. There's some really beautiful stuff here that I don't see written out very well in the literature. But this coupling between lambda and mu is quite beautiful, and it has roots in information geometry. Okay, so what I've done basically, I've taken the gradient of this guy, I've written it like this. With that, now we can see it as kind of a moving average. So we see that we have this old parameter lambda. So it's kind of our old belief. And then we have some new information that comes in through the natural gradient. So whatever we have learned before while doing this update, they're all in this lambda. But the new thing that we are computing now, given this lambda, whatever we haven't learned so far, comes in through natural gradient. So you can think of it as like innovation in Kalman filtering, for example, if that's comfortable to you. So this is new information. It's the new thing that is being added to your lambda, and then you kind of update it. And if you continue to do it, you will get to the optimum of this objective. Okay. So I mean, if this was kind of a conjugate model, it'll turn out that rho will be just 1, and the natural gradient will just give you the exact posterior. And I'm not going to get into that. It's actually written in the paper. Maybe that's a more easy way to convince the Bayesian audience. But I have done this talk for non-Bayesian audience, so I'll take that route and I'll go there. But I'm happy to kind of have more questions on this, and probably those explanations will be easier for you to understand. So actually, this was originally proposed, this algorithm was proposed in 2017, but it was proposed in a very narrow context of doing some kind of non-conjugate variational inference. But then in last few years, Howard Drew and I kind of worked on it to make it more general, make it a more general Bayesian principle that applies to all sorts of non-Bayesian paradigms as well. So it was kind of the work that we did. Essentially, we show that if this algorithm is exploiting the posterior's information geometry, so this Q is the posterior candidate, and now if we change Q and we make some approximation to this natural gradient, we can derive all sorts of algorithms from it. Okay, so next 20 minutes, I'll essentially just kind of give examples of this, make you feel comfortable with this form, and connect it to some things that you know. Okay, one thing that I want to say, people who already know natural gradient descent perhaps know the name Amari, who is a very famous information geometry person from Japan. One thing to remember, that this natural gradient that I'm talking about here, it's different from the one that you may have heard from Amari's paper and the one that you might have seen in deep learning. Mostly people are talking about maximum likelihood estimation there. So it's not a Bayesian objective. And essentially the loss contains the distribution that's being used in the loss. So in maximum likelihood, Q is the likelihood, and then you maximize it. But then the parameter of that likelihood is what you're optimizing for. So that's different. This is over theta, right? This optimization is over theta. And so you get Fisher of theta. But here, loss and the distribution, they can be completely unrelated things, okay? And they're going to be kind of related using this entropy. It's a little bit subtle point that may not, go through at first thought. I still wanted to point out that here Q can be an arbitrary distribution. I could choose Gaussian, but loss could be anything on a real valued parameter. And I support matches, so I can use a Gaussian. And then the Fisher here is a Fisher of the Gaussian. It has nothing to do with the loss. And it's very amazing that it actually turns out that if you use this, you can recover the maximum likelihood natural gradient descent from this algorithm. So actually, the natural gradient descent that Amari is talking about in some of his papers, of course, his framework is much more general. That is a special case of what I'm talking about here. Okay, so just to remember that. Okay, so let me give you the first example of how to derive gradient descent from Bayesian learning rule. And here what we will see is that once it's a very simple example. Essentially, we'll show that Euclidean gradients become equal to natural gradient in this very simple case. So natural gradient is equal to the gradient itself, and that will just naturally kind of appear by making several approximations. So this is kind of the first line. There are more complicated example, but for the talk, I picked the simplest one. And this will tell you how to proceed, and the rest of the algorithms, they're always derived in the same way. Sorry, my kid is back from the school. Let me close this. Okay. All right, there's a different circus going on in the other side of this house. Okay, so let me start with gradient descent. It's actually really, really straightforward, and we'll go to a more complicated example afterwards. So gradient descent is just this simple algorithm. You take the gradient, take a step size, learning rate, and then you just kind of update your parameter. The claim is that you can choose Gaussian, you can fix the covariance, and this way, if you write the Gaussian, let's say the mean is the one that you're going to optimize with respect to, and the covariance, you can fix it to anything, but I'll just fix it to identity for now. And then if you do this, then from BLR, you'll get gradient descent. So we proceed by noting that the natural parameter is just the mean. Expectation parameter is also just the mean because there's only one sufficient statistics. And then the entropy is constant. So it's quite simple. You write this Bayesian learning rule. You know that mu is m, lambda is m, entropy is constant. So this kind of just goes away. So you get m, 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 right? So it's just gradient kind of, you're optimizing mean by taking the gradient with respect to mean. So it almost looks like this, but now there's an expectation because we are Bayesian. We don't think that there's one parameter. There's many parameters that are sampled from the distribution. So it makes sense that we are optimizing the expected loss. So you have to kind of, if you want to get the non-Bayesian method from a Bayesian method, you have to be more greedy. You have to ignore the posterior and only focus on the mean. So you can do the standard delta method. That's very famous in statistics. So you're just going to approximate the integral at just one value, at the mean, right? So you're essentially throwing away the posterior information and you're focusing only at one place, at the mean. If you do that, then you can see that BLR and gradient descent will be equal, right? So what it's actually basically saying, let's make lots of gross approximation, like let's not even go for the posterior, only look for the mean, try to locate this mean at some place. And then if I ignore the variance in my posterior and just focus on the mean, I'll end up finding the mode, which is kind of the maximum of the loss, which makes sense, right? So if you make really a lot of approximation, you will get gradient descent from it. But then, like what we thought when we did this first, we thought, well, then we should be able to show that if I don't make these gross approximation, it's very, extreme approximation of delta method. What if I remove this approximation? Then what does it do something better than gradient descent, right? So put the expectation or the Bayesian flavor back in, and then use the Bayesian averaging in gradient descent, and let's see what happens. So we've actually designed many methods based on this relaxation, which should improve the algorithm. And some of our work in the last few years have been to show that these algorithms indeed improve over gradient descent. So I'll get into that. So there's 3 papers on this that I've highlighted here. But before that, I want to give you a more intuition. Why would putting an expectation in gradient descent help? Okay, it's kind of looks like that, when you do gradient descent, you find one parameter, right, theta star. It's at the mode of the loss. But if you do the Bayesian learning rule with the expectation in there, so I haven't made delta approximation, the optimum is slightly different. It's something like an expected loss. So there's some kind of smoothing that's happening, right? But that's one way to look at it. But the other way to think about it is that you're introducing noise. So you're saying I shouldn't focus on theta star, just one point, but rather I should sample a few points around the theta star and try to average and see how the landscape is around the optimum. Okay, this is the way to think about it is that we are injecting noise, and somehow this noise has kind of a regularization effect. And it turns out that it's kind of similar to the noise in stochastic gradient descent, which is very popular in machine learning. So if you actually think about it, let's say you have a loss and the loss is sort of skewed towards one side, then once you start to do the expectation, it starts to smooth things around. It's actually trying to take the neighborhood information into account, trying to push you in a more flat place where things are not, narrow, where things are more spread out, because now you have the posterior variance that's helping you to do some averaging and be more stable. And this is kind of the principle that has been adopted in SGD. Many people argue why it actually works well, because it has some kind of implicit regularization into it. So I just wanted to show you an example of how SGD actually works. So let's say that you have, so this is actually logistic regression, by the way. It's one-dimensional. So you have like loss where this direction is kind of better, but then if you go on this side, the loss becomes very, very high. So logistic regression usually has this kind of asymmetric loss. And the minimum is somewhere here, even though you see it as a flat, because of the regularization, there's a minimum point, it's here. So what actually happens with SGD is that if you actually run it, it's with a very small step size. That means that the noise is very small. Then you converge to the mode. But if you increase the step size, so what I've done is I increase the step size and I take these red points in the trajectory and I form a Gaussian with it. You see that it's tend to push away from this wall, right? You can see that whenever it will go this side, the gradient is very high, so it will get pushed in the other side because it has noisy gradients. Right? If you further increase the step size more, you see that this noise really increases and it pushes you away from this high loss region. Right? So pushing you in the flatter direction, regularizing your solution to say I shouldn't be next to a place where there's a flat wall right in front of me. I should be in more stable region. Now this is really kind of the idea that somehow introducing noise leads to stability because you're doing averaging around. The gradients are kind of pushing things around and they, on average over the trajectory, they push you to the other side. Now this can be actually mimicked by this explicit regularization that we have in Bayes. And this explicit regularization comes through entropy. Essentially, entropy forces the posterior, to not become a delta mass, but rather have some posterior variance. So if you run Bayesian learning rule with the expectation in there, it'll have the same effect. It'll push your solution towards the flat side. So noise injection has this benefit that when you start to inject noise using your posterior, you will avoid the flat wall, sorry, the steep wall here, and go into the flatter direction in that side, very similar to stochastic gradient descent. So it's kind of the principle is that you should be adapting the variance. And if you adapt the variance, it will help you to kind of find solutions that are better. So there's some kind of regularization, not over optimize on your data, not go to this star, but rather push away to slightly a more regularized place, a flatter place. And this is there's a kind of lot of connection to the flat minima in deep learning that people use, but also relation to minimum description length, and lots of like entropy regularization in many other fields. They're all kind of trying to do similar things, that they're trying to keep the posterior variance in the posterior intact and not use a delta mass. Okay, I hope that this gives some intuition, even though the talk is about Bayesian learning rule and I didn't lose all of you in that. But now let's go and do the same thing again. Let's try to derive a more difficult algorithm. So let's try to derive Newton's method using the same mechanism. And what we will see now is that natural gradients will now just not give you gradient, but they'll give you gradient and the Hessian. Okay, so if you increase the complexity of the posterior, we'll change the form of the Gaussian. We'll get a Newton method automatically from it. So natural gradient will just kind of do its job automatically. So, okay. So Newton's method, as many of you may remember, so there's a gradient and there's a Hessian, and you do preconditioning with the Hessian, and then you update the parameter. The claim is that now we're going to let the covariance be also, an optimization parameter. So we're going to optimize both the mean and so S is the precision, S inverse is the covariance. And when we do this in the BLR, we'll get the Newton's method or something like it. Okay, we'll have to make some approximation to get to the Newton method. So we start in the same way. We write the natural parameter. Natural parameter is the precision times the mean, and the precision multiplied by -half. And the expectation parameter is just the mean and the correlation matrix. Okay, so this I touched upon before. And now we're going to do the same thing, right? We're going to write down this. We have lambda and mu, and we just basically plug this in. Entropy of a Gaussian is related to log determinant of the covariance, so it's not constant anymore. So we'll have to kind of use this property that we did before. I was explaining that gradient with respect to mu is just lambda. So we'll just write the form that I motivated this innovation idea with this. This is the new information, so we'll use this one. Now we'll just plug in lambda and mu. So put first this lambda, this is just S and M, and take the derivative with respect to the first expectation parameter. So then you repeat. So you take the second natural parameter, put it in here, take the gradient with respect to the second expectation parameter. It's very straightforward, very mechanical process. You just simplify a little bit. So I took the half out, put half here. Now you see there's two update equations now. One runs on the mean times the precision, the other runs on the precision. And they're taking two gradients. So we now try to rewrite this update a little bit more. We'll use an identity that almost is magical. When I sent this to Amari Sensei, he said that this is magic. But it's just an identity that you can actually derive this from Stein's identity, but this was done a long time ago. So essentially, you can rewrite the gradient with respect to the mean and the correlation in terms of the gradient and the Hessian. Okay, and so the important thing to notice that this gradient is outside the expectation. Okay, but this gradient on the right-hand side, it's inside the expectation. It's done with respect to the parameter. So you sample a theta and then you take the gradient with respect to theta. Here it's different. The gradient is with respect to the parameter of Q, right? So we have actually made a huge leap because we have taken, instead of taking the gradient with respect to the parameters, now we are taking the gradients of the loss itself. Okay, so this is how the Fisher and the Hessian sort of shows up of the loss function. This is based on the two identities called Price's theorem and Bonet's theorem. The details are in the paper, but you just have to trust me that there's no approximation here. This is just correct. It's just chain rule. You just apply it and you get it. Okay, so now what we do is we can just put it in this identity. We put it in here. And then we'll invoke the delta method to get the Newton's method. You don't have to do it, but we're deriving Newton's method. So push the expectation inside. So there's going to be some approximation. But once you do this, again, you'll have to trust me, but you can see that the update of this guy is kind of almost the same. I've just replaced this by this identity. So replace the gradient with respect to correlation by the expectation of the Hessian. Put the Hessian, and Hessian is at the mean now because I did the delta method. Okay, so I'm ignoring the expectation. I'm only using the information at the mean. The amazing thing is that this top equation can be rewritten in terms of the mean, and the calculations are very similar to Kalman filtering, going from information form to the other form, what the name is. And you write the mean, the update in the mean, and you get a preconditioning with respect to the covariance. It's like Kalman gain style thing that shows up in the front of your innovation. Okay, so here we have a gradient and then we have a preconditioning. And if you notice, if you put the step size to 1, so it's very much like conjugate updates. You have a closed form solution, so you just do rho equals 1. So maybe you're in an area where the Hessian information is really correct. It's very convex surface. In that case, this approximation would make sense, and you'll get something like, well, you'll get Newton's method. where now you can see that this method is optimizing the mean of the Gaussian, and it's using the, estimating the covariance using the Hessian. Okay, so the covariance is equal to the Hessian, and you may remember this as a Laplace approximation. Okay, so if you run this Newton's method, essentially the precision S is just the Hessian, and you are running a Newton's method instead of any other gradient method to get to that Laplace approximation. Okay, so it's quite nice that the method kind of just works. You just made this one approximation of delta method and the step size. So they did two things. And with that, you got the Newton's method. So when we did this, we were very excited. And I will maybe take 5 more minutes and I'll finish the talk, so we'll be on time. So when we did this, we were very excited, and it turns out that when we started looking into some deep learning algorithms, it turns out that they are actually not choosing the step size to be 1. Okay, so in explaining this in this slide, so this is the BLR that I wrote in the previous slide, but instead of choosing step size to 1, I left the step size now to be less than 1 in this case, and I've changed the step size for the mean update. Now, this is probably another approximation that I made some choices of the learning rates, and then I show the RMSprop algorithm that's heavily used in deep learning algorithms. So Adam algorithm is actually based on this RMSprop, and it's really very similar line to line. Okay, so you could see that here the theta is optimized. So this is like neural network parameters. They are just similar to optimizing the mean. There's a preconditioner, which is similar to this. And then there's a gradient, which is same as this. So in RMSprop, you use stochastic gradient. You can do that here. And they don't use Hessian. They use some, weird approximation because they don't want to compute Hessian because it's very computationally expensive on deep learning. So they use square of the gradient. But really, like, the thing is very, very similar. So what we said is that now, so you can do these approximations. So I just said these things. There's some small differences, but I'm going to try to, what we try to do is, sorry, maybe one more thing. So you can also design Adam, like building upon this. It's all written in this paper. I won't go into the detail of that, but you can get both RMSprop and Adam by making several choices of the step size and the gradient approximation, the Hessian approximation. With that, you can get those. But what we try to do is we said, what if we don't make those approximations? Can we improve RMSprop? Can we improve Adam by adding a little Bayesian touch? Right. So that's essentially what we did. So this is RMSprop. It's written in a slightly different form here. Then we designed a Bayesian learning rule variant where we don't make bad approximations. So we don't remove the posterior averaging. So we put the expectation back on. So we sample from a Gaussian. We use just one Monte Carlo sample for MC for that expectation, but we are actually using the noise now. So we put back the noise, the Bayesian noise, and then we don't do square of the gradient. We do some kind of Gauss-Newton approximation that's closer to Hessian. So maybe then with that, we hope that this S, the precision that we get, will lead us to like better variance. It's written in a slight, different way, but essentially this is like the precision parameter that gives you the variance. So the inverse of that precision plus some constant. This is the prior actually. Precision plus the prior gives you the posterior variance. So now we can estimate variance from these deep learning algorithms. So we just make some small changes to the code, and we are able to now add variance estimates from some Bayesian principle in this RMSprop algorithm. And we want to see if that actually improves the deep learning algorithm. So essentially, well, I'm not going to go into the detail of how this is done, but the result sort of looks like this, that if you do a non-Bayesian algorithm, so this is Adam, So this is a classification algorithm, classification problem. You get one line, so you get one theta and you get one line. But if you use a Bayesian method, because you're sampling, you are sort of like getting many samples. You get many solutions that tell you that there's not one classifier that classifies the data. There are multiple. There are many of them that are good. So you're sort of like not looking at the one point in this loss function. You're looking at many points that are sampled from the distribution, which is an approximation to the posterior. And you sort of cover the region in your space where you don't see the data. So you're less kind of confident about your solution and maybe more robust. We use this on ImageNet. So because the algorithm is so similar, we can run it at a very large scale. So this was actually done in 2019 at ImageNet level. So you have like 1 million data examples, 1 million parameters, more than, I don't remember exactly what's the scale of this, but this is like the ResNet, the largest model at the time. And there was no other Bayesian method at the time that could actually scale and give the same result as SGD and Atom. The y-axis is the accuracy, and you can see that our method in red is able to get the same accuracy and also kind of behaves very similar. Shows very similar behavior. But now you can estimate uncertainty from it without kind of adding any computational overhead. So you can be Bayesian, but you have not really increased the computation cost, which was kind of a, for us, a personal breakthrough that we were very happy about. And then 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, some of the group members and some person from Germany, they got together and they applied this to Approximate Inference Challenge for deep learning at NeurIPS. And really, we didn't have to work very hard. We got first prize just by doing this algorithm. So we use a slightly more advanced one that we have done in this third paper, but that also kind of just worked out of the box. Okay, so this kind of bringing me to the end of the talk. I mean, it's what I really try to show you is that you can add the Bayesian touch to these non-Bayesian algorithms by kind of unifying these algorithms, right? So we show you use this information geometry style thing, and many of these algorithms like gradient descent, Newton's method, RMSprop, Atom, some ensemble of Newton, like doing ensemble method in deep learning, which is very popular. You could do mixture of Gaussian. You can do all of this. So you can improve deep learning algorithms because you can see them from a Bayesian perspective. So they're all optimizing a Gaussian approximation or a mixture of Gaussian approximation to the posterior. So now we can inject noise in deep learning algorithms to not let them be overconfident. Right? That's kind of the main idea in the work that we did. So just close with a the thing that maybe if you read the paper, so it's in this paper, Con and Drew, 2021. It's still not finally published, but it's on arXiv, and it will be published soon. But the main points I've highlighted here. So if you read this, so this is kind of gives you the crux of the paper, that natural gradients are everywhere. They're inherently present in all sorts of things. So we kind of show this fixed point, and we talk about why somehow this is missed in the literature. It's not talked about. People think that when you do natural gradient information geometry, you're doing something special, specialized. But actually, it's kind of a superset is what we believe. We see all kind of Bayesian things are doing information geometry. They're exploiting it somehow. And we believe that there is a fundamental principle here that all sorts of algorithms, good algorithms, they are also exploiting this information geometry, and you can see them through this lens. So I hope that you will enjoy reading this part of the paper. It's very much in the third page of the paper. But with that, I'll close the talk. So I'll talk about information geometry. I talked about information geometry of Bayes, unify, generalize, and improve learning algorithms. The main point is that we optimize for posterior approximations through a rule that is a natural gradient descent algorithm. It's a Bayesian learning rule. You can derive many algorithms from optimization, deep learning, And Bayesian inference that I didn't talk about today, but in the section 5 of the paper, you'll see all sorts of things that can be written in the same way. So my talk is about this one point that natural gradients and information geometry are important. We should learn them. We should use them. They are everywhere. If you like this talk, the more kind of long tutorial, I gave this 2-hour tutorial at NeurIPS a few years ago. Check that out. And
sorry, you are muted. You might have muted yourself.
that was weird.
Okay.
All right, good. So yeah, maybe I was moving the mouse and it just touched the mic. Yes, sorry, I hope you didn't miss too much, but we're excited about a new principle called Bayesian duality principle, which really builds up on Bayesian learning rule. We're able to show that lots of duality results that exist in non-Bayesian literature in optimization, they can all be kind of seen through the Bayesian lens. So it's kind of similar to what was done in 1970 by, oh my God, I forgot the name of the cardinal method person. Okay, sorry, I'm blanked out now. But female researcher, yeah, she did a lot of work in that time, showing some relation with Bayesian non-parametrics. And now we are rediscovering that some of these things actually are quite general, and they are in many other things that people use in machine learning and other fields. So we have a Bayes duality project. We have lots of funding. We're very lucky. There's some collaborators, and we're working on this. And if you're interested, please reach out to me, and we can collaborate maybe. So this is the group, and with this, I thank you for listening.